Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Jason White and this is Jason's Weird Reads, and today we're going to talk about some weird fiction. I got some recommendations here for the week of weird, so how about we get into it? I have quite a bit of books here I want to discuss. I'm not too sure if I'm actually going to get into them all, but there's a big huge list here. Before I get into the actual prompts, I have some miscellaneous stuff here that you might be interested in if you want to get into weird fiction. So let's get into that. There's some really interesting things here. If you've seen the old movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, this is an anthology edited by Joseph S. Pulver Sr., and it's called The Madness of Dr. Caligari. And it has stories in here by Ramsey Campbell, Joseph S. Pulver, Damien Angelica Walters, Rhys Hughes, Robert Levy, David Nickel, Richard Gavin, S.P. Miskowski, Jeffrey Thomas. So many awesome writers in here. Michael Griffin, who I'll be talking about. Some of these authors I'll be talking about. Michael Sisko, John Langan, Gemma Files, a lot of classic, well, not modern classic writers here, and obviously all the stories in here are they're an ode to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And if you're a fan of Thomas Ligotti, or if you don't know if you are or not, there's another Joseph S. Pulver Sr. book here that I have. It's called The Grimscried Puppets, and it's an ode to Thomas Ligotti, and it has stories in here by Livia Llewellyn, Joseph S. Pulver, Michael Sisko, Nicole Cushing, Cody Goodfellow, Michael Kelly, John Paget, a favorite of mine, Michael Griffin, Scott Nicolay, Simon Strances, Paul Tremblay, Jeffrey Thomas, John Langan, and Gemma Files. Very much almost the same list as the Caligari one. This one, Autumn Cthulhu. This one is done by the Ezine, the Lovecraftian Ezine Press, and this one has a lot of names that are heavyweights in weird fiction, like Laird Barron, Gemma Files, John Langan, Scott Thomas, Joseph Pulver, Jeffrey Thomas, and Damien Angelica Walters. It's a fantastic collection of short stories, all sort of Cthulhu rated. And finally, in this little section of miscellaneous that you can check out, Cthulhu's Daughters. So this is an anthology of Lovecraftian horror written by women. And there's a lot of really cool authors in here as well. Gemma Files, Lindsay Holder, Laura Blackwell, Premi Mohammed, Angela Slater, Jilly Dreadful, I love that name, Nadia Balkan. So definitely check this out too. Alright, so into the prompts. Prompt number 1, we have Old Weird Read. A weird story or book written in the 1910s to the 1970s. The 1910s to the 1970s, I think, is very pivotal to weird fiction, because that's where it started. Well, it started in the 1800s. It's basically they're calling ghost stories and vampire stories that were written in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Anything that was just kind of weird because it had a ghost in it, or a vampire, or something like that, or it had like a cosmic element to it, which is where reality sort of starts to unfold. They just labeled as weird fiction. Horror fiction did not exist back then. It was just weird, and weird it was. So I'm going to start off with what Crystal. I'm going to link Crystal's video of her recommendations. Go check out her from Fiber Artsy. Her recommendations are just outstanding. She has a lot of books that you can check out, so go check that out. It's in the comments. But she talked a lot about this book, and man, this book is a weapon. It's massive. It's like 1,000 pages, and it's like double-sided on each page. It's massive. If you can get through the entirety of this book, there's a lot of old fiction in here. There's a lot of new fiction in here as well. But it's an anthology. It basically takes you from the beginning to where we are in more recent times. And I can't recommend this enough. I haven't read it all. I mean, it would take a lot to read all this, but I highly recommend this. It's a beautiful book, and like I said, it's got a ton of history in here for the weird fiction genre. It covers it all, man. There's like so much in here. It's insane. But I highly recommend, if you really want to learn about weird fiction and where it comes from, to read the forewords and the introductions at the beginning, because there's a lot of really interesting pieces of information in those. And also, I got this for, I think, my birthday a year or two ago, and it's The Women of Weird Tales. This is basically a collection of short stories from back in like the 30s to the 50s, I think, of women who were published in Weird Tales magazine, which is it's huge. If you're into weird fiction at all, you know what Weird Tales is. If you're into horror, you probably know what Weird Tales is as well. But we have some classic writers here, like Everett Worrell, Eli Coulter. There's actually like some of these. There's a lot of like Everett Worrell has like 4 or 5 stories in here, and Grayla Spina, I probably didn't pronounce that right. She has like 3 in here, maybe 4. Mary Elizabeth Councilman. You might not have heard of many of these people, because or these women, but they did have stories published in Weird Tales magazine, and this collects a bunch of them. I don't think too many women were published in Weird Tales magazine, but the ones that, well, some of the ones that were are collected in here. All right, one of my favorites of the old classic weird fiction is The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. It's basically a short story or maybe it's like a novelette. It's very short, maybe a novella at the biggest, but it's basically about 2 guys who take a trip down a river, and they're in a boat, and the beginning of the story is just that. They're like going through the woods, and they're in the river, and then they come to this island, and they decide that they're going to camp there. It's like an island where the river splits around it, and so you have this little island where they decide they're going to camp for the night, and apparently that was a huge mistake, because it does not go well for them. Weird things happen to them, and when I say weird, I mean weird. Another favorite of mine, but I haven't read in a very long time, is The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. Pretty sure it's how you pronounce his last name, Machen. I think I've heard it pronounced as Machen or something like that before, but I'm pretty sure it's Machen. This is another classic. It's influenced a lot. It influenced H.P. Lovecraft. The Willows probably did as well. Also, if you just want to check out some, you don't want to get too weird, you just want to check out some ghost stories, I suggest reading any short story by M.R. James. He's a huge influencer of the weird fiction genre and horror genre itself. It doesn't hurt to check out. He mostly wrote ghost stories. I haven't read all of his short stories, but the majority of what I've read of his short stories is ghost stories. So you definitely want to check him out, especially if you want some history. Also, another favorite of mine, I was really happy to see that Cabinet of Curiosities actually adapted this, because I've never seen or heard of an adaptation of this, and not too many people have actually heard of this story. But The Graveyard Rats by Henry Kuttner. This is the adaptation on Cabinet of Curiosities is pretty intense, but the short story is really intense too. And if you don't know what it's about a grave robber who he goes to fresh graves, and he digs them up, and he takes all the valuables. And in this one case, he sees that the body is missing, which obviously pisses him off, because he wants all the valuable jewelry that the deceased person would be wearing. But the body's gone, and he notices that where the feet would be, there's a giant hole, and so he decides to go crawling in there. If you're claustrophobic, this isn't a good story for you, because it involves him squirming around in the tunnels that have been dug out throughout the entire graveyard, and he gets kind of stuck, and it's a little bit intense for that reason alone. And finally, I am going to recommend one of my ultimate favorite weird story tales. Not too sure if I have it here in physical copy. Hang on. I only have... No, I don't. Okay, so The Sword by Robert Aickman. I don't have the physical copy of that. I'm pretty sure it's Cold Hand in mine, and I don't have that one. But I do have The Wine Dark Sea if you want to check out more Robert Aickman. And Dark Entries. Robert Aickman wrote really quiet, sort of strange stories. He liked calling his fiction strange fiction instead of weird fiction. I don't know if he did that because maybe weird fiction was sort of on its way out and the title horror was being more implemented at the time. He wrote in the 60s, and he wrote short stories, so that's important to mention as well. But his short stories were all strange and weird. But The Sword is one of the most weird and bizarre and affecting. The only way I can describe it is affecting. I'm not going to really describe exactly what it's about, because I started reading that one just not knowing what it was about. But like I said, I'm pretty sure it's in the collection Cold Hand in mine, and it's just weird. The basic premise is a guy goes to he's at a circus, and he goes to a show where they're doing things with swords. I'm going to leave it at that. It's one of the oddest and subtly disturbing stories I have ever read. The ending is just, it makes you wonder exactly what you just read. I can't say enough. I've read this short story at least 3 or 4 times. It's incredible. Check out The Sword by Robert Aickman. I can't stress that enough. Okay, so now we're going into number 2. Prompt number 2, New Weird, read a story book written in 1980s to the present. And this is where all the new weird is coming in, whether you want to call it Jeff Vandermeer's new weird or just still weird fiction, more modern day weird fiction. So speaking of Jeff Vandermeer, I'm highly recommending either Born or Annihilation. Annihilation is the first of a trilogy, and Born is the first of another, I think, trilogy. I know it's a series. It's either a duology or a trilogy. I've only read Born, and I've only read Annihilation from those 2 series, but both of them are great. I would argue that the movie adaptation for Annihilation is actually better than the book, but only because the characters are a little bit better fleshed out and they have actual names, where in the book they don't have names. It's also a lot more colorful. Like all the colors you see in Annihilation, that's not included in the book, but the book is still fascinating and awesome. I would never insult the book. I just think the movie is a bit better. And Born is just incredible. Like, Born is just one of those books that you have to read. I absolutely love it. Next up, I want to talk about Daniel Brahm. New Weird. You can check out this entire collection. This is his most recent collection. I believe he's coming out with a new collection in recent times. I've talked to him in recent times. He's coming out with a new collection within the next year or 2, I think. I could be wrong on that. But I've had him on the channel a couple of times, and you're going to see him again in the future. This is a fantastic collection, very subtle. He's a huge fan of Robert Aickman, and it shows, not in the sense that it feels like you're reading a Robert Aickman story. He manages to somehow catch the subtle strangeness. And I'm going to talk about one of these stories in a little bit later. He's got a couple of collections out before Underworld Dreams, like The Wish Mechanics and The Night Marchers. I recommend everything he's written, especially, don't go in to most of these books, but definitely Daniel Brahm, don't go in looking for fireworks and a lot of gunfighting. You don't find that really in weird fiction at all. These stories are subtle. It's more about character development and experiencing maybe something that's happened that affects you for either the rest of your life, or at least in the moment before you die. But yeah, it's very subtle. It focuses on character and maybe even language. But I love Daniel Brahm's work. I'd also suggest Children of the Fang by John Langan, or any other collection by him. This one is it's been cited as one of his best collections. He has 3 or 4 collections, but I definitely go with Children of the Fang. Any collection by Laird Barron. I have a collection of Laird Barron here. The only one I'm missing is Beautiful Thing That Happens to Us All, I believe it's called. But Occultation, if you're looking for the darker stuff, I would go with the Imago sequence or Occultation. They have the more horrific things. But there's also Swift to Chase, which all the stories in here are very loosely connected. They're all Alaska stories, as Laird Barron has said, and they're utterly fantastic. I love Laird Barron short stories. And I would also highly recommend Michael Griffin. He is another fantastic short story writer. You can also check out his longer pieces. This is one of his collections, The Lure of Devouring Light. I highly recommend this. It's beautiful. I have another one of his here that I would like to. I'm going to suggest later, actually, because it's more of the science fiction element. For that prompt, I can't find it here. I know I pulled it out. Oh, there it is. All right. So definitely check out Michael Griffin for the modern. And what else? Philip Fracassi. Definitely check out either Behold the Void or Beneath a Pale Sky. And there's another Philip Fracassi I'm going to suggest down there for the nature or fauna one. All right, now we're going to move into section or prompt number 3. Out of This World. Read a weird story or book with science fiction elements. So, might as well start with Michael Griffin, because I just finished talking about him. This is Armageddon House. Now, this isn't everyone's cup of tea. If you don't like ambiguous endings, then you might not like this. You might get a little lost. I had to reread a few things over, but I personally like the ambiguous ending. I like how strange things can get. Short summary of what this book is about is 4 people wake up in this weird sort of bunker, and they soon realize that they've been stolen from their lives, and there's some sort of science experiment, and they have to try to figure out exactly what's going on. What I really enjoyed about this book, I think it made my number 1 book of 3 years ago, 2019, I think. I could be wrong. But this book, the thing I liked about this book the most were the characters and also the strangeness, just the whole setup. It was just kind of a mystery from the beginning, and the characters were all very intense, and I absolutely loved that. A Haley Piper, Your Mind is a Terrible Thing. I just finished reading this, and I've called it bonkers. It's definitely a little bonkers. It's about a guy, actually he's sort of like sexless, so I can't say it's a he, it's a they. They wake up on a spaceship, and everyone is gone. They're missing, and there's these weird spider creatures that attack you, and they sort of implant these weird images into your head. It's, like I said, it's definitely, it fits this category, as I think a lot of other Haley Piper books would. And it takes place in space. There's not too much science, but there's definitely a lot of science fiction elements. Next up, I have Jeffrey Thomas. You could probably pick up any one of his Punktown stories. He has a bunch of collections. Jeffrey Thomas is known for his Punktown stories, and there's I don't know how many collections he has that he wrote in this world. Punktown is basically a city on another planet, and he bases a lot of his stories there, and they're collected into these Punktown and collections, and I'll have a picture of maybe the most common one there. But I highly recommend reading his Punktown books, or any book by Jeffrey Thomas. He's awesome. Also, I would recommend. I didn't mention this guy in the classics, but you could definitely read a lot. You could read the majority of H.P. Lovecraft, or just one or two short stories. It doesn't really matter. But for this prompt, I am recommending the Dunwich Horror, which has some scientific or science fiction elements to it. It's also has some very intense and surprisingly gory scene in it. The Call of Cthulhu, which involves a scientist who's investigating the phenomenon that is Cthulhu. The Call of Cthulhu is very much like an onion. It has very many different layers that you got to peel back. And also the Shadow Out of Time, which is a kind of a reality bender and time travel story. They're all very good. Now, I know that H.P. Lovecraft was pretty disgusting person, but I started reading H.P. Lovecraft before I knew all that stuff, and I just can't escape him. He did influence a lot of horror and weird fiction, and cosmic horror especially. All right, what else do I got here? That's it for the Out of This World prompt. We're moving into number 4, which is The Dark. Read a weird fiction story or book with supernatural or horror elements. I want to recommend at the top here The Worm and His Kings by Haley Piper. This is a really fun cosmic horror story, and it's very dark and involves a cult and the forgotten New York subway systems, so it's all underground of New York City. And also there's a book 2 coming out very shortly. I just saw the cover reveal, and so that's exciting, but this book is fantastic. Now, Hallucinogenia, I hope I pronounced that right, by Laird Barron. It's in one of these. I think it's in this one. Let me see here quickly. But yeah, it is. It's in the Imago sequence, and it's a novella. It's about 50 to 60 pages long, and it is one of the darkest stories I think I ever read. It had a lot of first season of True Detective, that classic first season of True Detective. Do you remember that? I remember being absolutely blown away by it when I first watched it as it was coming out, and I don't ever do that, but I did with that one. You know what? I want to sneak in a favorite of mine here. You can read almost any one of these stories. There's a supernatural element, I would say, to every one of these stories. But if you wanted a recommendation, I would go with, if you like creepy dolls, I would go with the Namesake, The Secret of Ventriloquism. That's a great story. But I would also go for Origami Dreams, especially if you like the really reality sort of crumbling on you and you're stuck in a sort of a loop. That story is fantastic for that. Those are my 2 favorites from this collection. The Indoor Swamp is really good too. So Secrets of Ventriloquism by John Padgett is one of my favorite collections, and I can't recommend the audiobook for this enough. John Padgett, who is a ventriloquist himself, narrated this, and it is creepy as hell. The first 2 or 3 stories are just like, I call them, they're like the basic story, and if you're listening to them, you'll be like, I don't know what he's talking about. This is it's good, but it's not that good. But then you get into like the really weird stuff, and where you see John performing, and my God, it gets creepier as it goes. Let me tell you that. Next up, I have Mike Thorne, Shelter for the Damned. It's about a group of kids who discover a shack, basically an abandoned shack in a cleared out area of the city. A shack that's not always there. I'm just going to leave it at that, because it is a cosmic horror story, and the ending is just like out there. It's weird. But if you follow it, I was able to figure out what was going on, and that's something I really enjoyed about Mike Thorne's novella here, is that it's not just weird for the sake of being weird. There is sort of a thread that you can follow. I would also suggest his collection of Darkest Hours. There's not all these stories are weird or cosmic horror, but a lot of them are. And same with his other collection, Peel Back and See, which is another great collection of, I would say there's probably less cosmic horror in here, if I'm remembering correctly, but it's still a really great collection. One of the weirdest stories I ever read is in here, and let me see here if I can remember the title. I think it's Vomitus Bacchanalius. I hope I pronounced that right, but if you want a really weird story, check that one out. And also I want to recommend Wounds by Nathan Ballingrud. This is it's 6 short stories or novellas that all center around the border of hell. And this this collection of short stories really does have that feeling, that every story has that feeling that you're close to hell. It's a very good story, and one of them is being adapted. I can't remember which one. I read this like a few years ago, and I absolutely loved it. But it's weird stories, and hell is involved in every story, so you can't go wrong with that idea. All right, next up for the next prompt, we have Flora and Fauna, read a weird story or book featuring nature. So this is where I want to go back to Daniel Brahm. The first story in here is pretty. It has like a really brutal scene involving the beating of a shark. So if that seems like something that would trigger you, I would maybe avoid this one. But I can't recommend this one enough. Otherwise, it's How to Stay Afloat When Drowning. It's an ocean story. And it's very subtly weird. Like I said before, he's more about the character and the language. But How to Stay Afloat When Drowning is one of my favorites by him, and I'll be returning to it over and over again. The first time I talked to him, I believe, was because of this collection, and we discussed that short story, and he also read a piece from it. So that was he actually read that disturbing shark scene. So if I remember, I'll put a little marker up here so you can go check that out. Again, Jeff Vandermeer, Annihilation or Born. I already talked about those books, but Annihilation and Born are very I wouldn't say they're surrounded. Like Annihilation is more about nature, because this comet sort of lands. It's either a comet or an asteroid, I can't remember exactly, but it lands in this piece of land that it starts warping reality around a certain diameter of land, and so the nature is obviously affected. Born has a lot of nature in it because it's post-apocalyptic and nature is sort of taking over, and you have this crazy-ass bear that flies around the town. I know that sounds crazy, but it's actually really good. So definitely check out Jeff Vandermeer. Also Finch. Finch deals a lot with fungi, and it's the 3rd book in a series, but I can't recommend it enough. You don't need to read the other 2 books. This book stands alone on its own. But it was my first Jeff Vandermeer book, and it was the book that made me fall in love with him. And I also want to recommend The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft. It's my favorite H.P. Lovecraft story. It's very sort of similar to Born in that it's about an asteroid that lands on a farmer's land, and slowly but surely the ground, the grass and everything around it starts to die, and like all this other stuff is growing, this alien type stuff, and it's affecting the farmers who live there in a very strange and exceedingly creepy way, especially near the end. And there's also this color that has never been seen by human eyes before that these people can see. It's a very odd but awesome story. It's like I said, my favorite by H.P. Lovecraft. I can't recommend Color Out of Space enough. And the recent adaptation with Nicolas Cage is a really good rendering of that story. I highly recommend you check that out too if you want. Michael Griffin. He has 2 novellas out that, or I already talked about one of them for the science fiction one, but this one, Hieroglyphs of Blood and Bone, involves a guy who recently lost his wife, and so he moves in with this younger guy. The main character who lost his wife is an older man, and he moves in with like a college-aged kid, basically. And it was a mistake because this guy lives a lifestyle, and he wants to keep the old guy going because, you know, you just lost your wife. You gotta party up now. You know what I mean? But they end up taking like a fishing trip, and they go out into this piece of land and by the river where they're gonna fish. And it's sort of like Shelter for the Damned by Mike Thorne, where he sees this shack with a woman in it, and he slowly becomes obsessed with this shack and the woman, more the woman than the shack. But he goes back for it and he can't find it, and then he does find it, and some very weird things happen to this guy. You don't know if he's losing his mind or if maybe there's a lot of skeletons in his closet that he's trying to work out. And lastly, I want to talk about Sakilina by Philip Fracassi. This is one of my favorite novellas by Philip Fracassi. It's about a family, a father and two sons who decide to take a boating trip because one of the sons was just released from jail. And so it's like a freedom trip, you know, let's go celebrate life. And they get something weird happens involving these weird mussel creatures, and that's where I'm going to leave that, because the thing I like about Philip Fracassi is stories like this of his is something that could happen, and yet it's still weird, and it still has like a almost supernatural feeling to it, even if it's all completely natural. And so I highly recommend Sakilina. All right, I think that's my recommendations. I don't want to go on too long because I could have talked a lot about more authors, and you know what, I forgot some. More miscellaneous here. I did brush on Thomas Ligotti in that one anthology, but I can't recommend enough Teatro Grotesco. This is my first collection of stories that I read by Thomas Ligotti, and it absolutely floored me. And I also have this, Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe. And if you're an audiobook listener, this one was recently made into an audiobook, and it has the fantastic reader John Paget, which I talked about. He has one of my favorite collections. John Paget, a very talented voice actor and ventriloquist, I'm certain. But he narrates this. He's a huge supporter of Thomas Ligotti, and he was lucky enough to get this role. I can't wait to listen to his rendering of these stories. And also, I want to, in the miscellaneous, you could probably do a lot of you could probably fit a lot of Caitlin R. Kiernan's work into the science prompt. But I would recommend checking out The Very Best of Caitlin R. Kiernan. This is like one of her collections that's the easiest to obtain, and it has a lot of her classic, or a lot of their classic short stories that I don't know, man. Her fiction gets very dark. I mean, very, very dark, and a lot of the times it's very weird, and you don't know what the hell is going on, and I love that. All right, so that's my recommendations. All these books and authors, please go check them out. I love weird fiction. I have to admit that I am not an expert on weird fiction. I wish I was, but if you want to learn a lot more about weird fiction, go check out the Lovecraft E-Zine podcast. They have a channel on YouTube here, or you can listen to it from your favorite podcast supplier, such as Apple Podcasts or whatever it is you use. They have these guys who run this podcast. It's headed by a fellow named Mike Davis. He edited Autumn Cthulhu. It's buried now, but it was one of my suggestions here. He edited that. He runs the Lovecraft E-Zine. And these guys like, these guys read a lot of weird fiction, a lot of Lovecraftian type fiction, and cosmic horror. These guys are very knowledgeable. Just go through their backlist of podcast episodes and you'll learn so much. I've gotten so many recommendations just from listening to their podcast episodes, and they're, like I said, and these guys know everything that's out there. I swear to God, go check them out. All right. There's my suggestions. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, leave me a little octopus that looks like Cthulhu, or a spaceship in the emoticons down there in the darkness. Keep being safe, keep being creative, and I'll catch you guys in the next bookish video.